Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's ESRI webinar to launch our report on after-school care for school-aged children in Ireland. My name is Martina Lawless. I'm the director of the ESRI, and we're very pleased to launch this report today, which is part of a research program funded by the Department of Children, Disability and Equality. So it's a very important topic. Obviously, there's been always a lot of focus on childcare for children before school starts, but school and work days don't align very well. So childcare for school-age children is still a very sort of big issue for a lot of parents. So we're very pleased today. We'll have a presentation by the authors of the report, who are Helen Russell, Emer Smith, and Eva Slevin. And then we'll have some responses from some experts in the field. And followed by that, the people online will have a chance if you want to pop some questions in the chat there for the authors or for the respondents. Before we get to the report findings themselves, I'd like to pass over to Ciara Pigeon, who's the Head of Research and Evaluation in the Department of Children, Disability and Equality, to say a few words about the research.
Thanks, Martina. I'm really pleased to be here today at the launch of this report on after-school care, which has been produced as part of our research programme with the ESRI. Research using Growing Up in Ireland data often allows us to focus in on particular groups of interest, like children in poverty and disabled children. But the topic of today's report on after-school care is really something which affects the everyday lives of many, many children and families across the country. Today's timing wasn't a deliberate choice on our part, but for me, it's particularly apt. There was huge interest in this report in my own household this morning. And on Thursdays, one child goes to after school care, another child goes to her grandfather, and another child is old enough to look after himself. And they were full of opinions about why the different outcomes might, the reasons behind them. This report is one of the reports produced, as I said, under our research programme. The choice of topics is hugely influenced by the policy needs of our department. And we're also very keen to maximise the use of Growing Up in Ireland data as much as possible. On behalf of the department, I'd really like to thank the authors of today's report, Helen, Emer and Eva. Also our steering group members, Morag Henderson, Nuala Connolly and Jamie McCarthy as well for their input. And also our colleagues in our early years division who've engaged with this report. This is an area that's experiencing lots of change. It's influenced by a variety of policy, economic and social changes. So it's really valuable for us to have this detailed and comprehensive view of after school care and the experiences of our oldest two cohorts in Growing Up in Ireland. And it will definitely inform how we look at the experiences of our new group born last year. They're a few years away from after school care, but they're going to get there sooner or later. So huge thanks as well to the CSO for providing access to the data, and of course all the Growing Up in Ireland participants and families that make this research possible.
Okay, thanks very much, Ciara. And so we'll pass over now to Eva, who's going to present the findings of the report on behalf of all the authors.
Thanks, Martina and Ciara. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully nothing will go amiss. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming to the launch of this new report. I'll be presenting the report today, and as you know, with co-authors Helen Russell and Emer Smith. And this is again part of a project with the Department of Children, Disability and Equality. So this report explores after-school care for school-aged children in Ireland. So first of all, a bit of definitions. We use the definition of after-school care as term-time care for school-aged children, which includes after-school clubs and centres, childminders and relative care. Now, this is broader than the legislative definition, as it includes that relative care and childminders, which is maybe less formal. So for this report, we examined the predictors of care type in Ireland, so examining child and family characteristics, and then we go on to looking at the outcomes, which looks at the pastimes and activities of children in different types of care, and then moving on to their cognitive and socio-emotional outcomes at age 13 based on their experiences at age 9. So a bit of background, the Growing Up in Ireland is a longitudinal survey, as many of you obviously know, so following cohorts of children throughout their lives and providing a really, really rich data source. We specifically focus on cohort 08 and cohort 98 and use the data collected when these children were 9 and then at 13. So for cohort 98, that was 2007 and 2008, and then again in 2011 and 2012, so kind of the recession years, and then for cohort 08, 2017 and 2018 at age 9, and then 2021 and 2022 at age 13, so that's during COVID. And we're very grateful to the CSO and the CV in providing this data and the GUI for such a rich data source. So a bit of background, like early learning and care, after school care is a really important sphere for the child's development and learning for those who participate. Most school-age children in Ireland are cared for by their parents, but non-parental care is increasing. So it is something that is important to look at. The current literature in this space dominantly focuses on early learning and care. So there is a space for research specifically examining school-age children. School-age childcare policy has also developed substantially in recent years. So we saw the Action Plan on School-age Childcare in 2017, guidelines on the registration of school-age childcare in 2019, as well as the National Childcare Scheme in the same year, which introduced increased subsidies for parents of children up to the age of 15. There was also national quality guidelines for school-age childcare services in 2020. And then finally, the launch of the public consultation on the regulation of school-age childcare in September 25, so that's ongoing. And many, many other policy developments, but those are kind of the ones that we're highlighting. And so this slide just provides an overview of the services who filled out Pubble's Early Years Sector Profile Survey. So it just gives an overview on what after-school care is like in Ireland. And this survey is open services contracted to deliver CD funding programs and schemes. And it's important to note there is no state provided after school care. So here there was 1,728 services offering both school age care and early learning and care. And then 651 services offering only school age childcare. These services are quite different in that many are located on school premises. So 64%, they're not run by the school, they're just located on the premises. And then 51% are established since 2021. So since cohort 08 were 13. So we will see, obviously, it is increasing over time. We also see from these data sets that there is a really high waiting list for school-age childcare places, but there are also many vacant places, which suggests a potential mismatch between supply and demand. So first we'll go on to kind of chapter 2, which looks at patterns of after-school care and the predictors of different care types. Some quick definitions. So we look at after-school clubs and centres, which are defined as formal after-school care during term time that occurs in a group setting. Then childminder care, which is paid care provided in a child's own home or the childminder's home. And relative care, which is care by relatives and friends in the child's home or the relative and friend's home, which includes paid and unpaid care. Self and sibling care and parental care are kind of self-evident. And the categorization of the main type of care that the child is in is defined by the primary caregiver. So this bar chart looks at the main term time care for both cohorts across ages 9 and 13. The remainder of each chart, so kind of going from that red box onwards, is care by parents. So the parental care is the remainder. And obviously that makes up the majority of care in Ireland. It has reduced between cohorts, so from 76.4 to 71.2. And there's very little difference between the use of parents for care at age 13, but this may reflect some pandemic distortion from 2021 and 2022. The use of non-parental care has increased across all 4 categories for children in the 08 cohort compared to cohort 98, and self and sibling care increases to a great extent between age 19 and age 13 for both cohorts, which likely reflects the increasing responsibility as the children ages. The proportion of children minded by themselves or siblings at 13 has increased between cohorts compared to a reduction in the use of childminder and after school care at age 13. But again, there's probably a pandemic distortion in that case. This graph shows average hourly costs for childcare for each cohort at 9 years. You can, it shows the average cost in euros. And this is only showing those paying for care, so the average for those paying for care. So in a lot of cases, relative care doesn't cost anything. So this shows the change in childcare costs between 2007 and 2017, and this is adjusted for inflation. So there is an increase in cost that we're seeing over time, which you can see in the difference between the blue and orange bars. Across the board, costs are highest for childminders, and it also increased most on average between cohort 98 and cohort 08. Here we look at hours in childcare at 9 years, and this is just children in non-parental care. So this is children receiving care. So most children are not spending large amounts of time in non-parental childcare at 9 years. So the most common amount of time children spent in childcare in both cohorts was between 5 and 9 hours. And that's about 35% of both cohorts. This might be due to this being the minimum hours required to bridge gaps between school hours and parental working hours, or maybe just costs and availability of childcare for that amount of time. Very few children are receiving more than, say, 25 hours of after-school care. So here we're looking at factors influencing the use of just after-school clubs and centres. So that's the formal care in the group-based setting. Maternal employment is the strongest predictor of after-school club and centre use, which is consistent with findings elsewhere in Europe and the OECD. We'll also see later that it's the strongest predictor of using other care types compared to parental care. Income is also an important predictor of after-school care and centre participation, and it has increased into cohort 08, which reflects maybe those changing costs. So you can see here in the graph that costs have increased between so for the highest income quintiles, the ones with the most money, they're more likely to use after-school care at age 9 in cohort 08, whereas income quintiles with less money have a less likelihood of using it. So this is then predictors of different care types. So not just after-school centres and care, it's self-sibling care, relative care, childminder care, and after-school clubs and centres. And this shows the significant characteristics that predict care type at 9 years for children in both cohorts. So children in cohort 08 are more likely to use relative care than cohort 98, but otherwise we don't see a significant cohort effect. So we don't see a massive difference between likelihood of the different care in each cohort. Lone parent status then is a predictor of using any non-parental care type, which is indicative of the additional support required by this group. Having an older sibling is a predictor of self and sibling care, which makes sense. And then having an older sibling reduces the likelihood of using any other type of care compared to parental care. Having a younger sibling is positively associated with childminder use. Disability status of the child is only relevant, or it's only significant for relative care, with disabled children less likely to be cared for by relatives than by parents. We can see here again the importance of maternal working hours. So they're positively associated with the use of any non-parental care type, and is the most significant predictor of care type here, particularly relative childminder and after-school clubs and centres, which are the paid types of care. Income is not significant for self and sibling care, but it is significant for using relative childminder or after-school clubs and centres, where children in higher income families are more likely to use these care types. And it is particularly significant for the use of childminder care, which we saw in previous slides had higher costs on average. So this kind of makes sense. Then children in special schools are less likely to be minded by a sibling, while being in a higher school class, so 4th class versus 2nd class, reduces the likelihood of using a childminder. Finally, rural children are more likely to use childminder care or childminders compared to urban children, while the opposite is true for after-school clubs and centres, which maybe reflects a lower supply in rural areas or less options. So now we move on to the results of chapter 3. So we're looking at activities and pastimes among 9 and 13-year-olds, and how these differ between care types. So firstly, for friendships and peer interaction. We saw at age 9, children generally had 2 to 3 close friends that they saw 2 to 3 days per week. And the frequency of seeing friends was actually quite consistent across care types compared to being cared for by a parent. We did find that relative care was associated with smaller friendship groups at age 13. Then for organised sports and cultural activities in this case are music or dance classes. The majority of 9-year-olds in both cohorts were involved in sports clubs, which is excellent. And more children at 9 years were involved in sports clubs if they were cared for by childminders. At age 13, the majority of children are still involved in sports clubs, just less so than at age 9. Being cared for by childminders or after-school clubs and centres is a positive predictor of sports involvement at 13. Then for reading, we found that reading for pleasure is lower for children minded by themselves or by their siblings. And involvement in cultural activities, so that's again the dance or music classes, is lower for those in relative care, just for cohort 98. With regards to screen time and internet use, we found that there's more widespread phone ownership for cohort 08, which makes sense due to the more ubiquitous phone usership at this point, and there was higher phone ownership for those in relative care. We found that 9-year-olds spent 1 to 3 hours watching TV daily, and relative care was associated with more TV watching for cohort 98. The time online, so like the phones, increased significantly between cohorts, which again just reflects the increased use of the internet for kids these days. And those in childminder care spent less time online. We also found that screen time varied less across care provision at age 13. And this is again compared to those cared for by their parent. So finally, we look at cognitive and socio-emotional outcomes at age 13. And I'll just explain through the kind of what we used to measure cognitive and socio-emotional outcomes. So for cognitive outcomes, the measures differed between cohorts, and that was due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So for cohort 98, growing up in Ireland, used the Drumcondra verbal and numerical reasoning tests. And this is a more robust score than what was used in cohort 08, which was a verbal fluency measure that could be delivered over the phone. Then for socio-emotional outcomes, the strengths and difficulties questionnaire was used, which asks a series of questions in kind of 2 main categories, which is externalizing problems and internalizing problems. So for externalizing, that's conduct and hyperactivity, and then internalizing is more emotional and peer problems. So hopefully that makes sense. So for cognitive outcomes, we had, for cohort 98, there was higher reading scores associated with childminder care, but that is mainly due to family type selection, so class and maternal employment. So it became less significant once these controls were added. There was a positive relationship between maths scores at 13 and childminder care, and after-school club and centre care at 13, so the continued use of after-school clubs and centre care when they were 13 was associated with higher reading scores at 13. For cohort 08, we found that children in relative care had lower cognitive scores at age 13, so that's that verbal fluency measure, compared to parental care, but other care types were not significant. For socio-emotional outcomes, the overall, so that's the aggregate, so strengths and difficulties questionnaire score, there was no effect between care type. When we split this into externalizing and internalizing scores, the externalizing scores were higher for children attending after-school clubs and centres, but it is important to note that there are very small effect sizes. So externalizing is the hyperactivity and the conduct problems. Child characteristics, so for example, a disability, and family characteristics like maternal education and income have much more association with socio-emotional outcomes than care type, from what we found. So there's overall small effects of care type on outcomes. That's both socio-emotional and cognitive. This is likely due to the short amount of hours that children spend in these care types. So like we saw, kind of 5 to 9 hours per week, and then a lack of information on quality and other information about that we can look into more kind of differences between care types. So I'm going to go over some of our conclusions and implications for policy. So since cohort 08 were aged 9 in 2017 and 18, there have been significant policy development in Ireland, as we discussed, for example, the National Childcare Scheme. And following these developments will be important for future research, particularly for the cohort born in the new cohort for the Growing Up in Ireland study. The continued growth and provision of group-based after-school care, which we see through the PUBL dashboards and then through the census, suggests that a higher proportion of children in the future cohorts might use this care type, particularly or especially if quality is improved or costs reduced. We also find the choice of care type is limited for low-income parents and those in rural areas. So that's definitely something that can be focused on. And we do see that costs have increased beyond inflation, particularly for that childminder care, which will influence care decisions and the labour market choices of parents, particularly mothers, as we saw from that really strong maternal employment effect. The National Childcare Scheme and the current consultation on the regulation of school-age childcare will be absolutely crucial in supporting positive change in quality and access to school-age childcare services. Thank you. And yeah, thanks for joining.
Thanks very much, Eva. That's a great overview of a lot of interesting findings there. And now I maybe turn over to our two expert discussants to kind of give their reactions and thoughts on the results. So I'm going to start off with Louise Kilban, who's the program chair for the Diploma in School Age Childcare at Atlantic Technological University. Louise?
Hi, thanks, Martina. First of all, I absolutely welcome this report from both a professional level, but also as a practitioner who's worked in the sector for many, many years. I suppose it is something that we have been calling for to see a lot more research, particularly in this particular area. For me, there was a couple of main takeaways that I was quite interested in, and I think looking at the long waiting lists that are there for school age care and the effects of that rural urban divide is probably something that we're continuing to see a little bit of. But I know Eva has quite rightly pointed out in the last couple of years we're seeing I suppose a growth in services that has been offered around the country. I think if I look back and I reflected on the report, historically, school age childcare was developed for children and families in socio disadvantaged areas and to support educational outcomes. So I was quite fascinated with some of the findings that a lot of the children and families using the centre-based childcare or school age care services were from higher incomes. And I suppose that reflects the cost and the rise in costs on these services. I also noted one of the findings, parents' knowledge of the NCS, the National Childcare Scheme, for childminders. It doesn't seem to be widely known. I suppose maybe as somebody who works in the sector, I was fascinated with that because NCS rolls off all our tongues at this point. So it was interesting to see that there is some lack of awareness out there. But for me, play came up, and I know that has been an area that we've talked about in the past and has been reported on before. So it was great to see that kind of sent and fronter of the report and the benefits around that. And I suppose as a practitioner, it's typical, we don't see a lot of 13-year-olds in school age centres. And you have to, I suppose, look at schooling at that point, and most 13-year-olds are in secondary school. So that development of school age centres for children, and I suppose that home care, their relatives and sibling care. So they were my initial thoughts on this.
Thanks very much, Louise. And then I can ask Toby Wolf, who's a principal officer in the Quality Childminding and Early Years Strategy Unit at the Department of Children, Disability and Equality, to give his reaction to the report's findings. Toby?
Yeah, thanks, Martina. Yeah, just first, I mean, just a couple of, I suppose, overall reactions. I mean, first to say, look, it's extremely useful to have this research on after-school care. I think Kira, in her opening remarks, spoke about the value of the research program as a whole to the policy work of the department, and this is a clear example. It's especially, I think, valuable to have findings from a representative sample of children and this longitudinal data that allows progress over time to be monitored. Clearly, the data was collected several years ago, so the findings inevitably, I suppose, predate many of the policy reforms that have been mentioned. But they do provide an important baseline for future comparison that allow us to see, with the next wave, the next birth cohort in the GUI, to look back and see how things have changed. And they do also fill a real gap, and Louise was saying that as well, like in the lack of research on after-school care. So it's great to have this research. Very interesting findings on who uses different types of care and the different impacts. I mean, just on the who uses it, clearly that partly reflects the policy context and the context at the time when the surveys were undertaken. Issues like availability of places at the time, cost to parents. But I think it also, it sheds some light on purposes, why people make the choices they make in after-school care. Clearly, there's a very strong finding that the patterns of use of care particularly reflect parental employment. Undoubtedly, that's a major reason why parents make the choices they do in terms of after-school care. Longer hours for childminding may reflect greater flexibility to facilitate parents' employment. A striking feature, though, is how much after-school care is parents, how much is relatives, which I think raises a question as to whether to what extent that's parental choice, or to what extent it's necessity because of the shortage of affordable places. It was showing the increase in use between the two cohorts in care for 9-year-olds, so that might reflect supply beginning to grow to meet the unmet demand, and we've seen that trend increasing in more recent years. Also just struck the lower use of centre-based care among the 13-year-olds compared to the 9-year-olds, which we also see reflected in more recent data on school-age childcare, which may reflect a view that perhaps there's less need for organized care for this age group, for the 13-year-old group, especially when there are older siblings in the house, which seem to be a factor. But again, it may also reflect lack of options that are particularly suited perhaps to the needs of the older age group. Perhaps just a couple of other responses just on the impacts that were mentioned there. Clearly, family and school factors seem to have a much bigger impact overall than care type on child outcomes. But it is interesting seeing some of those impacts of care type in different directions. Even though they may be small, there are some effects. But as was rightly noted in the presentation, there's no measure of quality available to really allow us to see under the hood of what's driving these different factors. It could be that a small effect may mask the fact that perhaps there's positive effects and negative effects depending on the quality of a particular care setting. So, clearly, there's a need for more research in that area. But I think there's also, a challenge in agreeing what are appropriate measures of quality in school-age childcare. I think there's less consensus on what quality looks like in school-age childcare than there is in early learning and care, which partly reflects the lack of research historically on after-school care, though we do now have these national quality guidelines on school-age childcare. Also, just one final thought. I thought it was interesting to see the possible importance of location of care arrangements impacting on children's friendship networks. I think the finding was specifically in relation to relative care, but it could have wider relevance in thinking about the best location of school-age childcare and childminding settings with benefits perhaps of being nearer, for benefits to children perhaps of being near a home or near a school.
Thanks very much, Toby. Maybe you could follow up on one of the comments you made there. There has been a lot of policy change in this area since the data was collected. Maybe yourself and then Louise could give us some reflections on what you think broadly the impact might have been on service providers, families, and children of these recent initiatives. And before I let you answer that, I would just remind other people on the call that if they have any questions or comments themselves, they could like pop them in the chat or the Q&A function there, and we could put them to the authors. But Toby first.
Yeah, sure. There have been quite a number of policy changes since I think it was 21, 22 was the final, I suppose, data gathering, and some of them were listed on one of the slides. But I suppose just to pick up a couple of significant ones on affordability, there was mentioned already of the National Childcare Scheme. So that came in 2016, offering subsidies to parents who use registered childcare. With higher subsidies for lower income families. In 2022, it was extended to right through the age range up to 14-year-olds. And since 2022, there have been further increases in, I suppose, the level of subsidy. So, so that's going to have an impact on costs of using registered forms of after-school care, whether that's centre-based or home-based. And in particular, it'll have an impact, I think, on costs perhaps as a proportion of income for lone parents. We know that the National Childcare Scheme has particularly benefited lone parents. And I think that was noted in the report that there was one group that saw a relative decline in participation between the two cohorts. So I suppose costs are now lower, and the impact on costs of who uses school-age childcare may have changed. Access is also a constraint in some areas. There's clearly been a very big increase in recent years in the number of school-age childcare, the group-based services, and that seems to be growing, continuing to grow. But I think childminding is likely to remain an important source of school-age childcare over the years to come. But there's also been work underway to improve quality of after-school care provision, which we hope will impact positively on both children's well-being and their development in different settings. So we had an action plan in 2017, the National Quality Guidelines for School-Age Childcare published in 2020. But I suppose the process of supporting those is really only getting going now. But there's also a process of regulatory reform underway. So childminding regulations came in 2024 on a voluntary basis. They'll become mandatory by 2027. And school-age childcare has been registered since 2019, but there's comprehensive school-age regulations due in next year. So I think the effect so far of that regulatory reform process has primarily perhaps been to create a mechanism by which new school-age childcare services can benefit from subsidies, so reducing costs for parents. But the forthcoming regulations next year, alongside the quality guidelines, I'm hoping that we will see over the years to come a positive impact on the quality of provision, which should impact then on child outcomes in various ways. But there are a range of these developments are still in train. They're still works in progress. That on the comprehensive regulations, as was mentioned, the public consultation has just closed. There's further work to be done over the coming months on that. Review of childminding regulations will take place in the near future. And there's a commitment in the programme for government as well to reduce the cost of childcare further over the lifetime of the government. Planning on that still underway, but it will over time impact on affordability. But of course, ensuring that supply can keep up with demand and the quality rises at the same time are going to be policy challenges.
Okay, thanks very much, Toby. Louise, do you have any kind of further thoughts on those more recent initiatives and what impacts they might have?
Certainly, and I absolutely agree with everything that Toby has already mentioned. I think for me, one of the biggest impacts going forward will be the Nurturing Skills, the Workforce Development Plan, and that commitment that is in there about establishing the qualification for school-age childcare. I suppose it's well known, it's widely reported that currently there is no qualification required to work in school-age childcare. However, we do know from the report and other reports that many people working in school age have a qualification in early learning and care. But we do know that early learning and care is focused on a specific age range, where school age does go right up to that 14, 15 years. So I think when we look to our counterparts across Europe, and particularly I suppose the Sweden, Denmark, where they have these formal qualifications in that leisure time pedagogue or that leisure time educator, and the outcomes there for children are significant, particularly around that social emotional development and well-being. So I think the fact that we are at that space now, the commitment has been made by the government, and it's widely welcomed. And we do know that it's ongoing, and it's something that's constantly been currently worked on. But the fact that we are moving towards that professionalization, qualification standards in school age, I'm going to be really interested to look at the 2024 cohort, when this is, a comparative study is done in 10 years' time, when those children are 9 and 13, and they're moving through the system, to see the differences as our policy has developed. And it has been a rapid development. We all are very aware of that. And when we look 2017 and then 2021, and since 2021 we've had a number of developments. The school age action report in 2017. So it's wonderful to see these policies. But I think when we look in 10, 15 years time and we do a comparative, it will be interesting to see the socio-emotional benefits and the well-being of those children. And I suppose, as Toby has quite rightly, and I'm not going to repeat what he's increase accessibility for parents is going to be very important going into the future. And I suppose where we have centres going forward, so the policy will be very much in support of looking at where school age childcare services are available for children and families going into the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Louise. A couple of questions coming in the Q&A function. I think the first one is possibly a little bit more for Toby than for the report authors, which is related to security of tenure for the school age children providers operating out of the school. So this is Teresa Heaney, who makes the point that if the Department of Education directive requires all schoolrooms to be used for educational purposes, so that this after school age children operators may occasionally be required to give up their space if the school decides they need it for other purposes. And it's such a sort of a constraint on the availability and the building up of this type of care.
Yeah, we really need somebody from the Department of Education perhaps to comment rather than myself. But yeah, I know that can be an issue, particularly I think for early learning and care services where they're located on school premises, where that can happen, that there can be a tension. Schools may be keen to facilitate them, but have their own pressures on space. I think it's less of a problem in the after school needs, because you're talking about the hours after the school day is ended. But I know that pressure on school premises can be a problem. But I think as the data was showing, while many of the school age services are on school premises, many of them aren't. They're in a range of different settings, and clearly we're also talking about childminding here in this report. So there's quite a range of settings being discussed.
Okay. And then there's another question on, is there potential for the Department of Children to engage with the Department of Education on this, and particularly in relation to the DESH Plus strategy? And I guess this links back to the finding in the report on income being such an important driver of what type of after school care parents choose.
Yeah, well, there are very close relations between the two departments on a range of policy issues, and actually, one of them absolutely is that question of how you support the most disadvantaged children growing up in the most disadvantaged areas. So, in early learning care and school age childcare, there's a program called Equal Start that has many similarities to the DESH program in schools. It only began last year, but it provides a range of additional funding and supports going into services in the most disadvantaged communities, and that includes for services that are providing group-based after-school care.
Yeah, thanks. And then we have as a comment from Sharon Bowles. Thanks for the useful research. And as a county childcare committee, we've seen a significant rise in after-school care being developed in rural areas and attached to smaller rural schools, reflecting the need in that rural locations. And that very much urban-rural availability and choices came up quite strongly there. Might go back to the authors to respond. Helen, I see you were putting up your hand. Perfect
Yes,
time.
I was just going to come in on the DESH point as well. So I suppose we know that within the DESH program there are supports for disadvantaged children, which would include, homework clubs and those additional sort of educational supports after school, which we're not necessarily picking up here in this particular study, because parents mightn't call that childcare, and nor do the departments see it as childcare. So those can be very effective programs, and I suppose the equal start, that new program for the early years, I think is very welcome. I think one of the other findings we saw in the report, we did look at the schools, the school principals, what they were saying about their after school facilities. So that's kind of broadly defined, and we did see quite a difference between urban and rural DESH schools in particular, and that the rural DESH schools seemed to, the principals were reporting that their after school facilities weren't I suppose as high quality as the others, or but they were not as adequate, I suppose that was the term they used. So so there definitely was that inequality there. It had certainly improved over time between the two cohorts, according to the principal reports, but yeah, you could see the urban rural difference there too.
Another question coming in there, Helen, from Maria Gaynor, is on tier 1 and tier 2 services generally have very low rates in comparison to other services. And could equal start funding go towards bridging the income gap to keep services accessible to low income families? I guess this funding and how much cost comes back to the parents is obviously a big determinant of these different choices of after school care.
Sorry, yes, I'm not sure if that was in relation to the funding for the providers, is it? Is that
I guess this is funding directly for the providers, but
Yes,
presumably that
yes.
feeds into then what gets charged to the parents.
Yes, I'm not entirely clear yet about what those the levels of support for the schools are, but I think certainly the model for the DESH in schools has been a very successful one. So I would hope similar resources would be allocated to the early years. I don't know if Emer wants to comment on that.
Well, we weren't looking at equal start as part of this because it does relate to the early years. As Helen said, there has been a good deal of expansion of after school facilities rather than care in DESH schools. And we've done other work using Growing Up in Ireland that shows DESH schools have actually been quite good at bridging the gap in the provision of things like cultural lessons, so music, drama, dance. They've actually kind of matched non-DESH schools in their provisions. That's also had a positive spin-off effect on participation in things like reading for pleasure. But again, these don't are not necessarily counted as parents as care, but certainly they're part of the suite of activities that promote child development outside school.
Okay. Thanks very much, Emer. I don't know, Toby or Louise like to come in on some of those general questions on the funding or on the kind of the range of activities being offered. I guess it's a little bit difficult to know what's being done in the after school care setting versus what children are doing elsewhere, and that makes the comparisons a little bit difficult from the data can't track every minute.
I suppose could I just come in on the point about operating out of schools? and the point that I suppose once school finishes, the rooms are available to school age providers. While I acknowledge that that may be the case, but the suitability of the room may not be available. So rooms still may have to stay within the structure of a school environment. There is I suppose, a turnover time that would be required from the time school ends to the time that children go into school age care space, and that turnover time, if the room is a shared space, could only be a matter of minutes, if seconds really. The school bell goes and they go out and they re-enter the space, that shared space. So I would, I suppose, caution a word of warning about the suitability of shared spaces within schools. So I suppose just going back to Teresa's point about that security of tenure for SAC providers, that as we develop provision, and Sharon's point around rural spaces, a lot of the SAC centres that are opening in places in rural areas are within school grounds, and it's to give them that protected space for children, that it doesn't become an extension of school, an extended school, because we certainly don't want that. We don't want school going on until 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening and starting at 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning, but that we have a protected space for the children. And I suppose more research would be required around that. What is that going to look like? And I know as we develop more policies and the qualification space, it's ensuring that we have that protected space for school age for children, and that they're not within that classroom environment for long periods of time.
Yep, that's a very good point. We have another question here, maybe back to Emer and Helen, on are there any other outcomes for children that we should be considering looking at on the impact of after school care in the future? If there was, obviously growing up in Ireland is just starting a new wave. Are there other outcomes that might be useful to
I
look at?
think if I could come in, yeah, I think really young people's own satisfaction and own feedback on the space. There's been some qualitative work that points to their valuing play and diversity of activities. But beyond that, we don't know very much about their own preferences, and especially when you're coming to talk about the 13-year-olds and what kind of constraints it potentially places on their lives, because it does seem to, that relative care is disruptive of the kind of peer group contact and bonding. So for me, that would be kind of the priority, would be really understanding their own perceptions of that care in interaction with the constraints then on their parents' part and availability of care types.
Yeah, thank you. Couple of other comments coming in. One on the issue of school transport to the school and pick up for the schools, which is a big element, maybe constraining parents' choices as well for school age childcare, particularly in maybe more rural areas. Have to, obviously
Yeah.
transport linked to school ending time. Helen?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, that is likely going to be behind some of those results as well. That for the services that are directly in the schools, that obviously gets takes that out of the equation. But I think for where it's in other premises, that's certainly a constraint.
Okay.
And also where there's rural bus transport, organised school bus transport, that is a constraint in after school care, but also in participation in after school activities. We see a very strong rural urban differences in some of those activities because, the school bus leaves at X time and that's it.
Yeah. And another question here from Roshi McCooney on if there is any available data, I guess, in the current source, or will there be a focus on free play opportunities, outdoor provision for children in school-aged care provision? Is that something there's any capacity to look at?
I think we don't know from the in the current data that we have, but it's certainly something that could be looked at. I know we have time use data as well that was collected, and it would be really nice to know actually, where children are undertaking those activities to and who they're doing with them with. So that would add to that picture, as Toby said, about sort of getting under the hood a bit. So at the moment, we have these this information about activities, and we have information about care types, but you're not entirely sure, what is happening within those hours that children are in the different types of care. So it would be nice to be able to match that up more closely.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen. Toby, did I see you wanted to come in with another comment?
Well, yeah, I was actually just going back to a couple of the other issues that came up. One was the transport issue, which clearly can be a challenge. I suppose it's one of the benefits of where after school care services are located on school premises is you don't the transport issue disappears. But I do think the question of children's preferences that Emma mentioned is very important. And the department had a consultation with school-age children some years ago when we were working on the action plan on school-age childcare to find out what children themselves wanted. Certainly children didn't want after-school care to be like an extension of school, and certainly there was I think a lot of children were happy being outside school premises, going somewhere else, particularly more home-like environments where it felt different from school. Now there's ways you can perhaps address that. Even within school premises, you can make things feel different. But that comes to the point, I think, that I think Louise was making about, are rooms suitable? Is a schoolroom suitable for after-school premises? How do you actually make after-school care that is the type of thing children want to be in and are comfortable being in, and where they can spend time with friends and socializing and relaxing, or doing a range of activities that are appropriate.
Okay, thanks very much, Toby. We've got a couple of other questions in the chat, or actually one from Tracy Heaney, not a question, but complimenting the authors on very interesting work, and definitely agreeing with the idea that a consultation with children about what they like and don't like about after school care would be something that's very useful. And Mary Roach also making the same point, that the importance of play-based provision, time to play in these after school settings, being very important. And then another comment on the availability within sort of space within school buildings, which I think, Toby, you've just kind of largely kind of responded to. So coming up reasonably close now to the end of the hour. Helen, do you want to?
Yes, I was going to make use of having our two panelists here and ask them one of the questions that was asked to me and I didn't have the answer to, which was around whether, with the new regulations and initiatives, which I do think are very welcome, are there any unintended consequences? Because we often hear this, that this will mean people will leave the sector, or especially in the childminders, if they were going to be regulated. So I was just interested to hear from the two panelists if they had evidence of that happening.
Louise, maybe comment on that one.
Nothing is springing to mind at the moment to me about those unintended consequences. I suppose, look, like with all policy that we bring in, there are unintended consequences that, hindsight is always a wonderful thing. Looking to our colleagues internationally, some of the things that we have seen happen is that some of the school age and after school provision internationally has become about improving educational outcomes. And so I suppose for me, I would hope that is not something that happens here. But I think we already have a very strong policy on that our school age services are not around education, and they're not homework clubs, they're not an extension of the education system that we have. They're an alternative care, and they are to support children's development. Just one thing that I think for policy going forward, and I know the research in this case was looking at term time care, I would be very interested to see non-term time care and what is happening with children in that non-term time space. Is it very much the use of summer camps and parents juggling that juggling piece? So for me, that's just a piece that I suppose, putting another question back to you, Helen, the next piece of research around what is happening to children in non-term time. So those summer holiday periods and holiday periods would be for me.
Toby, do you want to respond to Helen's question first, and then I'll go back to Helen on the summer holiday care issue?
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly the question of unintended consequences is something policymakers have to be, looking out for all the time, both trying to, in advance, work out how to, avoid things, but also once things start getting introduced, monitor them. So in the area of childminding, new regulations did come in last year. We went to a lot of trouble working with childminders to try to make sure that the regulations were proportionate and appropriate, so they would benefit children, provide the necessary protections, but that they wouldn't have unintended negative consequences, wouldn't drive childminders out. They're in place about a year, and our intention is shortly to commence a review of those initial regulations, because we know that sometimes you get things wrong. Things don't work out the way you planned. So we'll do this review, and we'll listen to childminders and see whether we need to make any changes or not. School-age childcare, we've had regulations in for a while. They were just very preliminary regulations. They've actually seemed to have had the effect of increasing the scale of provision rather than decreasing it. We've had a massive increase in the number of services since the regulations came in, because regulation has been the gateway to access to public subsidies, which have become much more generous, particularly for after-school care since 2022, especially. But we'll be working on these new regulations next year, and look, we'll be keen to ensure that they do the important jobs of protecting children, supporting children's well-being and development, without creating any unnecessary challenges. And I absolutely share Louise's interest. This research is fabulous. It would be lovely also to know a bit about what's going on in holiday care. Like, one of the issues that came up in this research clearly was it's only a few hours in a week that children are in after school care. The length of the school year means that children are often, in the summer in particular, out of school for 2 to 3 months out. And there's an interesting topic for research, is what happens and what are the impacts of that.
There you go, Helen. Idea for the next project.
Yes, no, I totally agree. It would be really, we don't have that data in the Growing Up in Ireland study. I just know from experience, it is a very challenging period when you have young children and you're trying to put together some sort of care arrangements over those holiday periods. So yes, absolutely. I think we should campaign to have that in the next wave of the Growing Up in Ireland survey.
Okay. Always good to end a research presentation with an idea for a new research project. So with that, I'd like to thank Helen, Emer, and Eva for a great piece of work. To thank Toby and Louise for participating in the discussion of it, and of course to thank the department for their continued involvement and support of research with the ESRI. Thanks to everybody for participating, and have a good afternoon. Bye all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.